Next, we're going to have a presentation on a very special person, our Yamaraja. He was a dedicated graphic artist who contracted cancer some years ago, and he was determined to get all of Richard Thompson's books back into print. And for years he labored. Some of them were just manuscript, some of them we didn't have films anymore, especially mechanistic science, just had some plates that some insects had gotten into, and some of them had to be retypeset. All the books are out on the table. He was able to get all of the books back in print, and he had one book left, and that was this one, the proceedings, the monographs from the 1977 conference. And he got that book finished, and after that he had accomplished his life mission, and very shortly after that he left us. And everyone who knew him had a particularly strong love for him. So our next presentation, let me see just for how long this will go. Our next presentation will be about 15 minutes on the special relationship that Robert Wintermute, was Yamaraja's name, had with the BI, with Richard Thompson and all.
Thank you for this opportunity to celebrate the memory of Robert Wintermute, Yamaraja Das, who is the longest serving member of the staff of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. But before I do speak of his passing, one of the things that I was especially impressed with by this gathering here today is that Srila Prabhupada's first book, which was described here as Easy Journey to Other Planets, published in 1959-1960, was inspired by two of the most important scientific and technological events of the 20th century. First was the launch of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. And second was the discovery of antimatter around the same time. And I believe antimatter is now referred to as dark matter or dark energy. So whether you agree with this idea, first, Easy Journey to Other Planets said that the true antimatter particle is consciousness. And second, that travel to other planets and dimensions can easily be achieved by this particle of consciousness. Now, whether you agree with this or not, it was a very bold and unique approach to see the possibility of a coexistence and correlation of ancient Eastern philosophy with modern Western scientific discoveries. In general, the idea of consciousness as a field of study does not excite Western scientists. As we've heard here today, it generates quite a bit of pushback. But there are researchers who have made headway. One example that I've looked at in a layman's way is the study into reincarnation at the University of Virginia by Dr. Ian Stevenson, and subsequently by the institute that he set up at the University of Virginia. And it was said of Dr. Stevenson by one of his colleagues you are either making a colossal mistake or you are the Galileo of the 20th century. Now, we've heard from Dr. Resnick yesterday that Galileo had a rather hard time of it, and I suspect that some of you will encounter similar problems, if somewhat less brutal opposition than Galileo did. But I hope that in the future you will all be considered the Galileos of the 21st century. I would add here that there is a common misconception that spiritual life and practice involves the complete rejection of this world and a Luddite attitude towards technology and science. Srila Prabhupada did not belong to that school of thought. His understanding was that all features of the material world are a reflection of a spiritual reality, and that alignment of the material energy to a spiritual purpose is the fulfillment of human life. The activities of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust are just such an alignment. We use modern printing and communication technology to enlighten, and many of us are privileged to participate in the work of the Trust, and one such of our colleagues was Robert Wintermute, Yamaraja Das. And although we've seen very wonderful presentations of what we might call the generals of the Bhaktivedanta Institute and Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, Robert Wintermute, Yamaraja Das, was one of the soldiers in the trenches, you might say. And his service, though less distinguished and celebrated, still had a tremendous effect on those who experienced it. Robert was born in 1948 and grew up outside Portland, Oregon. He attended Portland State College for 2 years, majoring in art, and then transferred to the University of Oregon in Eugene. He dove into the 60s counterculture, and his interest in Eastern philosophy inspired him to buy a copy of Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is. And that was one of what we call today the Purple Gita, one of those, which was, and his attraction to that particular book was because it was recommended by Allen Ginsberg in the introduction. And so this gave it, you might say, the imprimatur. And after a couple of years of visiting the temple in Portland, and he moved to the West Virginia farm community of New Vrindavan in 1971, and he was drawn by the idea of living a natural life in the country. In 1972, he was initiated by Srila Prabhupada, and in 1973, he was recruited by the East Coast branch of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. Interestingly enough, in 1972 was the founding year of the Book Trust, so he was in the Book Trust right from the beginning, and subsequently spent 45 years in the service of Srila Prabhupada and the Trust. He then moved to New York in 1973 and received training in layout and design for Back to Godhead magazine and for Srila Prabhupada's books. As an aside, I'd just like to mention that next month, on February the 14th, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of Srila Prabhupada's founding of Back to Godhead magazine in 1944. In those days, when he joined the Book Trust, layout work was all done by hand. In other words, printouts of text and photographs. I see Robert Grant here shaking his head and smiling at how it was in those days. And then these printouts were pasted onto boards, shot by a camera, and then these these photographic things were then they created what are called color separations, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which were then given to the printer and then shot onto the plates, which actually ran the printing presses. So he did all of that by hand. He moved with the BBT when they moved to Los Angeles in 1975, and he was part of the team that produced 17 books in 2 months in 1975, which was a landmark in the you might say the life of the BBT, and created a competence and created a spirit that was to last through to this day. Yeah. After becoming expert, of course, the digital age came upon us, and Robert easily made the transition to digital layout work. He's been designing and laying out BTG since that time. He was also an active photographer, and he shot many of the photos in the magazine. He also became very expert at creating art for the magazine from stock images. And we have a few examples here. We could have the next. Different articles where he would arrange and assemble different artworks. His association with Dr. Richard Thompson, which was mentioned earlier, began with first the articles in Back to Godhead magazine, and then more closely he laid out the first book, Mechanistic and Non-Mechanistic Science, which was described earlier. And he then, they enjoyed their collaboration very much, and so Yamaraja became Dr. Thompson's go-to guy for layout. Now, after the passing of Dr. Thompson, he helped, as was described also, in with the team that is now working to keep Dr. Thompson's contribution in the public eye by the website and so on. Now, in his personal life, Robert Wintermute Yamaraja Das was a celibate monk and practiced conscientiously the disciplines of spiritual life. He would rise early and attend the 4:30 a.m. temple program and chant his prescribed number of mantras. He maintained a strictly vegetarian diet, as well as observing the restrictions against intoxication and gambling. At the same time, he was diverted by computer games. And he attended the occasional LAN parties. For those who are uninitiated, LAN stands for Local Area Network. It is when a number of 20-somethings gather together in someone's garage and they put together an array of computers and then compete fiercely with each other to win these computer games. So that was one of his diversions. And also, he liked to go to the paintball range with the 20-somethings. And apart from that, he also kept his Beretta 9mm in perfect, and its reloading equipment in perfect condition. So that's a little aside. And about 10 years ago, he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is a form of cancer that attacks the bones. It is incurable, and the doctors examining him told him that his life expectancy was approximately 10 years. He underwent conventional treatments and took herbal medications to counter the side effects. Practically until the last few days, he was confident that he would be cured, and he would and could be cured. Now, throughout his life, his monastic life, he slept on the floor. But a few months before his passing, when his disease took a turn for the worst, his pain was so great that he could no longer raise himself up from the floor. So for the first time in his devotional life, he was persuaded to sleep on a bed. Multiple myeloma is considered one of the most painful of the various forms of cancer, but he was very stoic and did as much as he could to continue his service. As a stopgap measure, he consented to have Govinda Cordua, who had worked for the North Europe BBT, do some of the layout for the magazine. And Govinda's first efforts were met with, "Oh, I guess I'll just have to do this all over again." So he was very particular and very conscientious. Govinda did, however, manage to master the task, and he's now doing very well. In his last 2 days, he mentioned to a few people, "I don't think I'm going to make it anymore. I'm going to die soon." His personal caretaker observed a very deep shift in him, and there was an amazing glow on his face where he seemed peaceful from within, fearless of death. He left during the auspicious Brahma Muhurta hour. He was very inspiring and much loved by our BTG team, and we'll certainly miss him deeply and his service back to Godhead. Just before his passing, His Holiness Giriraj Swami wrote to him, and we can only hope that we too will remember these sentiments and instructions at our encounter with death. "My dear Yamaraja Prabhu, soon you will be leaving us and your cancer-ridden body to continue your service to Srila Prabhupada in more favorable circumstances. We wish you well on your onward spiritual journey, and we pray for your smooth transition from this world to the next by His divine grace. You have been a good friend and devotee, and we will miss you dearly. In fact, our hearts are filled with love for you. But we take consolation in the thought that we will be together again in service to Srila Prabhupada in another ISKCON in the spiritual sky. Now feel free to just fix your mind on the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada, on the sound of the holy name, and topics of the Lord and His devotees, and depend on their causeless mercy. Hare Krishna, your eternal servant, Giriraj Swami." Thank you very much.
Actually, I didn't properly introduce our dear Ranjit Prabhu, and I apologize for that. Ranjit is, for a long time, the treasurer of the BBT, and a long-time supporter of BI activities, attends some of our gatherings and gives us great inspiration. Thank you very much for a moving and heartfelt tribute.